The events of the last years reminded us of the role of political leaders and their role not so much in developing the down-to-earth everyday policy, rather than in shaping national culture, in the choice of ideals and goals for one's nation. Trump, Putin, Orban, Erdogan, Xi Jinping, one could continue on this list. This is the role of leaders, role of the authorities, the government, those in government, and becomes even greater when we see fledgling statehood or renovation of statehood, such as Pericles, Gandhi, Lenin, Mandela, King Juan Carlos, de Gaulle, Atatürk. This list could also be continued. And you can see, in this row of names, you immediately trace a trend, or rather two trends. The first to enlargement, to growth, to greater authority of the state over the society. And the second trend to decrease, to put self-limitations on authority. Paradigmatically in history, it means that George Washington refused to accept the throne and the crown that was basically given to him by the officers of the Continental Army after the War of Independence, of the American Revolution. And this is nothing more than a trend in novel Russian history that is in the 1990s. This is something I would like to discuss. I would rather identify 6 most important examples of self-restraint. I pointed out it's not just political, but it's also moral effort in the emergence of the fledgling Russian statehood. Firstly, obeying the constitution and the constitutional prerogatives of the parliament. In February 1994, that the national parliament was 2 months old, and it was known as the Duma, it adopted a law on complete amnesty of October and so-called putschists who attempted a coup in August 1991. Unqualified amnesty. It is difficult to find in Russia or anywhere in Russia when the regime that just has suppressed armed uprising would set free those who would openly defy this new government, the enemies who in case of victory would have surely have executed those who lost. In my biography by Yeltsin, I've got links to what conversations were led in the White House, led by Rudskoy and Hasbulatov, the leaders of the putsch, and the impression that they were just about to win. The dispute whether they should immediately execute Yeltsin and have him hanging in the Red Square, or just Stenka Razin to put him into a cage and transport all over Russia, demonstrating him to the public before the execution. Those who lost were set free, not only without any conditions or qualifications or reservations. The point is that under the constitution it's still there, but so to say, it's sort of in oblivion, but formally it is there. Under the constitution, the right to amnesty belongs to the Duma. They were set free, not just any qualifications, reservations, any limitations on political activity, be it at the regional or federal level. Many of them would later become governors or Duma deputies, for example, as Rudskoy, the then vice president during the putsch. Immediately I should make a qualification at the very start to start the disputes with the strands or arguments I would immediately accept. This is self-restraint and self-limitation by the government. It was also overcoming one's own urges. Overcoming one's own urges. When they heard about the Duma, Yeltsin became enraged. And he tried to overturn this order, accepted the... He tried to sign a decree on repeated arrest of those who were pardoned by the Duma, but he never did it. It was not only self-restraint, it also meant he had to overcome his own urges, because this huge Ural of giant, very ambitious former secretary of Sverdlovsky regional party committee, and Sverdlovsk was rated as number 3 after Moscow and St. Petersburg in terms of industrial facilities, but in terms of how many defense facilities they had, they probably would rank as number 1. Then he used to be the secretary of Moscow State Committee of the Communist Party. For this generation, I have to explain what this means. Moscow State Committee of the party, the largest party organization in the Soviet Union, and also a member who sat on the political bureau. It was not simple. It was meant overcoming one's own urges. I suppose in Russian history doesn't have any example of such dramatic, just swerving away from national political culture. Secondly, when he refusal to own this refusal to own 100% the courts and the judiciary, there was a decision of the Supreme Court in 1993 who made it possible for the regional judges and regional judiciary to consider matters of constitution. One of unprecedented was just this decision taken in December 1999 on acquitting. That was a decision by the Municipal Court of St. Petersburg about acquittal on the case of high treason and espionage against the former captain of the Navy, Alexander Nikitsin. His advocates, for that matter, the acquittal is based exclusively on an article of the Constitution that put a ban on getting access to and spreading the information. Advocate of the indicted Nikitsin said it was the first acquittal on the high treason charge put forward by the secret services of the country. In September 2000, the FSB went to lodge an appeal against this sentence, but still the acquittal was upheld by the court. He was again arrested for 10 months, stayed in prison, but he was set free on bail, and he stayed free for 5 years as this court hearing was heard, given who put forward and what kind of accusations. This is an unprecedented case in Russian jurisprudence. The most, I would say, not that outstanding, but maybe even more significant in this sense, in the sense of self-restraint of government, in this aspect, were made by the court cases, by citizens, or class acts, went against administrative acts of federal governments. Amongst them was the decision of the district court, who went against the act by the President of Russia, who just fired then Governor Cherepkov. The court found it unlawful, and in 12 days Yeltsin had to sign an act on restoring Mayor Cherepkov in his office. The number of such cases rose to 91,300, and on average, in 4 cases out of 5, the courts really upheld the complaints. That is, those who went against and protested against government acts. One of the largest decisions here would 200,000 retired pensioners who challenged the national law on pensions accrual. The third item I wish to make is the evolution of criteria of national success. This, I think, is one of the most important things. What I mean here is, in the political culture and the history of Russia, the grandeur of the country was not only determined by the grandeur of the state, it was synonym of that. That's why statehood, like almost all Russian reforms during Russian history, would have to do with modernization of the state, making it more effective and making it stronger, its power over the society. We remember a well-known memorandum by Nikolai Karamzin to Alexander I. He wrote, "The first duty of the Tsar is to preserve the unity of the state, caring for the well-being of the classes, and individuals should rank up to it." But as speaking from the presidential address of the 12th of June 1997 about the Day of Independence of Russia, I don't know, is it still known in Russia? For that matter, that used to be a major holiday in its day. The grand power, it's not just heaps of armaments and citizens who have no rights. It means independent, talented people with initiative. The basis for our building the Russian statehood is this understanding that our country begins with each and every one of us. And the only measure of greatness of our motherland is to which extent each citizen of Russia is free, is healthy, and educated. In this sense and in this connection, because of this rising trend to revise the criteria of national greatness and grandeur, it's important to recall one of the so-called cursed questions of Russian history, these dilemmas, that is, the correlation of internal domestic progress on the one hand and preservation of the empire on the other. The imperative to keep the empire in place was always putting the brakes to the internal domestic liberalization. That was the case of the reforms of Alexander II that were stopped short by the Polish uprising. That was the case of Khrushchev's liberalization that was stopped short by the uprising in Hungary in 1956. In reforms pursued by Kosygin, I may again later explain what it is to the local public, was stopped short by the so-called Prague Spring of 1968, where the Soviet tanks suppressed it. And probably for the first time in history, the leadership of the country back in the 1990s attempted to deliberately make a dividing line between Russian national idea and imperial thinking. And as a result, it made a separation from Russian statehood. The president of Russia would write on that day, Russia was always surrounding itself with a space where it dominated. Continuously expanding, it would exert most power as it grabbed more and more territory, and in this way found itself in direct conflict with the Western civilization. This degree of self-isolation is impossible. And in this regard, one can't but recall the negotiations with Ukraine. Actually, I think in the history of the so-called colonial or post-colonial separations and divisions between the metropolis and the subordinated territories, it's hard to find a precedent when obviously and clearly a greater, unmeasurably stronger and powerful mother country would conduct negotiations with seceding territory during such time and with such great patience that it showed towards it. It's enough to remember how England and Ireland, India and Pakistan, and Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia, they're separated. We can again discuss what happened here, but it's enough to recall that this process of negotiations with Ukraine on separating, amongst other things for that matter, the Black Sea Fleet and preserving Russia, which it had to pay for quite a fee, quite a substantial fee, to maintain its fleet base near Sevastopol. That was happening under huge opposition and pressure that they tried to put at the then quite independent parliament by the so-called National Patriotic Forces. The fourth key aspect, as I say it, in self-restraint of power was its attitude towards yet another structural dilemmas, which Lena discussed so well. The choice between dictatorship and unitarian state, on the other hand. The problem is that, very much like the US, Germany, Brazil and India, is too diverse and too great to at the same time to be unitary and democratic country. It has to make a choice, and in the history of the country, unitarian nature of the state was only supported by authoritarianism, and regional governance was just the implication of the weakening of the state. From Zemsky, that is local councils at the start of the reign of Ivan the Terrible, till lastly Sovnarkhozes in the times of Khrushchev. Well, the 1990s, given, this extent of these 10 years, this decade, was probably the only case in the history of Russia where it was at the same time remained whole, and that was not authoritarian. Just the two most important, but they're also the most obvious aspects of self-restraint by the state. They are exactly liquidation of state monopoly on politics. After Yeltsin's speech of the 28th of October 1991, the Congress of People's Deputies voted 86 pro and 16 against to set free the prices, to start privatization and to cut expenditure in order to saturate the market and to rein the inflation. In 2 months' time, the President of Russia spoke before the people, spoke before the nation on the 29th of December 1991, 4 days before the prices were set free. Their speech certainly, but not just of one person, I suppose, that was just an expression of this dominant trend for self-restraint by the government, and I would like to quote it because there are many things that sort of merge together, things which we're now faced with, and there's cursed questions of Russian statehood. They're again very much on the agenda. The President of Russia would say that this decision to set the prices free and to stop the monopoly on state economy stands in the same line with de-Bolshevization of Russia, its demilitarization, a new concept of its behavior in the world. With controlled prices, we leave in place mirages and illusions. It's now clear that it's impossible to build the communist utopia. It is not Russia that was vanquished, it was the communism. As we stop state monopoly of economy, we get rid of anti-human economic system that almost entirely focuses on military and defense production. Russia stops preparing for the war, and the Iron Curtain that used to separate Russia from almost the rest of the world is gone forever. Well, and finally, lastly, this is a fact of self-restraint by the state in terms of its own control over politics, political life. Makes no point to discuss it at length. I'd like to just quote several well-known facts that between 1993 and 1999, a referendum was took place and 4 national elections were held, and none of them would provoke any complaints either by the opposition or by the international observers. Both had unlimited access for observing how the vote went, and it was a matter of weeks after suppressing the uprisal, they repealed the temporary ban on participation in national political life of any parties with the 5 most active participants of that uprising.
The elections of the governors of the Russian regions were legitimized, and the government did not step back, even when during the elections of 1996, and one might remember that these were the simultaneous elections of the president and the governors. Only 1/3 were opposition politicians, and only several of half of those that had been endorsed by the president were re-elected during the elections of 1996. At a very high support level of the so-called red governors. Mr. Zyuganov actually prevailed over Mr. Yeltsin's candidates in 39 regions of Russia. Meanwhile, one should also remember, and this is probably quite a logical part of the then Russian politics, is and the Russian policies of the government, was that there was no longer control over information dissemination and the so-called national dialogue or the debates. And of course, the free flow of information and ideas were a significantly important constituent part of the Russian public discourse at the time. We have to understand that elections can hardly be called fair if there is a control over the exchange and dissemination of information and ideas. So, in this sense, I would argue there was the only period that could rival that period of political freedom in Russia of the 1990s would only be the period between March of 1917 and October of 1917. Censorship was abolished entirely, together with the ban of the political opposition parties. And one last thing I would like to mention in this regard. As a result of the state stepping back from trying to control and censor the national dialogue, the presidential elections of 1996 were also a referendum for the war in Chechnya. The reason being is that the mass media were one of the most important factor in stopping the war in the Caucasus in Chechnya. Indeed, let me quote a very important and respectable human rights activist, Sergei Kovalyov, who said that the war was ended thanks to the freedom of speech in 1996, and people understood that the only winning candidate, would have to resolve the conflict peacefully. At that time, General Alexander Lebed immediately called for peace, and this was indeed democracy in action. The Russian society had the mechanisms of exerting pressure upon the government to compel the government to end the war and comply with what the society wanted. And one may also say, and I keep talking about this unprecedented nature of these events in the history of Russia, which is, I think, important to emphasize. I think that this was the first case in the history of the Russian state when the war was stopped under the pressure from the voters. And one last little historical image. They say that after the end of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1798, when there was a woman who rushed away from the crowd and asked Benjamin Franklin, who was egressing a building, "What state have you thought up for the United States?" this woman asked, and Franklin said to her, "A republic, madam." Then he thought it over, and if you can keep it. So this is a fairly important addition, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. This tendency for self-restraint of power in Russia of the 1990s is a momentous event in Russia's history. Unfortunately, it became and was a lot more difficult to keep this veil. Thank you.